My name is Alice. I'm 32 years old, and I just handed the judge the one piece of paper that made him order the police to storm into the courtroom. The smell of wet cedar and stale dust always hung heavy in the air of grandmother's attic, but to me, it smelled like safety. Outside, the Seattle rain hammered against the Victorian roof tiles, a relentless rhythm that had been the soundtrack of my childhood. I wiped a streak of white primer from my forehead, tucking a loose strand of blonde hair behind my ear. My hands were rough, calloused from weeks of sanding floors and patching drywall. This house, a sprawling, creaky beast of a building, was finally mine. Or rather, it was finally going to be something. "Just one more room, Nana," I whispered to the empty air. "Then we can bring the kids in." My plan was simple. Turn this forgotten mansion into a foster home. A place for kids who, like me, felt like they were taking up too much space in their parents' lives. The only difference was that my parents hadn't put me in foster care. They had just boarded me at schools while they toured vineyards in Italy, or at skiing resorts in Aspen. A sharp, hollow knock echoed from the front door, cutting through the sound of the rain. I froze. No one visited this far out of the city, especially in this weather. I wiped my hands on my paint-splattered jeans and jogged down the 3 flights of stairs, the wood groaning under my work boots. When I pulled the heavy oak door open, a blast of cold wind hit me, carrying the scent of ozone and exhaust. A man stood on the porch, water dripping from the brim of a cheap fedora. He wasn't smiling. "Alice Vance?" he asked. He held a thick manila envelope in a plastic bag to keep it dry. "Yes?" "You've been served." He shoved the packet into my chest and turned on his heel, practically running back to his idling sedan before I could even grip the paper. I stepped back inside and kicked the door shut. My heart did a slow, painful thud against my ribs. I tore the plastic open. The paper inside was thick, expensive. The header was bold and terrifying. Superior Court of Washington, Plaintiffs Richard Vance and Diane Vance, Defendant Alice Vance. I sank onto the bottom step of the staircase, my legs suddenly feeling like water. My eyes scanned the legal jargon, picking out the words that mattered: undue influence, mental incapacity, fraud, immediate seizure of assets. They were suing me. My own parents, who hadn't visited Nana once in the 5 years she spent battling dementia, were suing me for the house. They claimed I'd tricked a dying woman. My phone buzzed in my back pocket. I pulled it out. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in 18 months. Mother. I stared at the screen as it vibrated, the envelope heavy in my lap. The renovation, the foster home, the safety I had finally built, it all felt like it was dissolving into the gray afternoon light. They didn't just want the money, they wanted to erase me. I didn't answer the phone. I let it ring until the screen went black, then watched a voicemail notification pop up a second later. I couldn't listen to it. Not yet. Instead, I spent the night pacing the hallway, the floorboards complaining under my boots. I read the lawsuit 3 times. Undue influence. The phrase made my stomach churn. It implied I had whispered poison into Nana's ear, that I had twisted her mind. The reality was much quieter. I had wiped her chin, held her hand during the terrors, and played her favorite jazz records when she forgot who I was. The next morning, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the sky remained the color of a bruised plum. A crunch of tires on gravel announced them. I looked out the window. A silver Mercedes, spotless despite the weather, idled next to my rusted pickup truck. Richard and Diane Vance stepped out. My father wore a camel hair coat that probably cost more than my entire renovation budget. My mother was in tailored wool, her heels clicking precariously on the wet stones. They looked like they had wandered onto the wrong movie set. I opened the door before they could knock. "Alice," my mother said. She didn't move to hug me. She just adjusted her leather gloves. "You look tired?" "State your business," I said. My voice shook slightly, betraying me. "May we come in?" my father asked. It wasn't really a question. He stepped forward, forcing me to retreat or be trampled. They walked into the foyer. My mother's nose wrinkled immediately. The air smelled of sawdust and old pine, a scent I loved, but to her, it probably smelled like poverty. "We tried to call," she said, running her gloved finger over the banister, checking for dust. "We wanted to handle this civilly, Alice, without the lawyers getting aggressive." "You served me with a lawsuit yesterday? That feels pretty aggressive." My father sighed, the sound of a CEO dealing with a difficult intern. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek, folded document. He didn't hand it to me. He laid it on the small table by the door. "This is a settlement offer," he said. His voice was smooth, devoid of any warmth. "We know you can't afford to fight us. Legal fees alone will bankrupt you before we even get to discovery. And frankly, this house is a money pit. You're drowning here." I looked at the paper. "What is it?" "We take the estate," my mother interjected, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "We sell the property to a developer who can actually do something with it. In exchange, we give you $50,000. You can start over. Somewhere smaller?" "A developer!" I felt the blood rush to my face. Nana wanted this to be a home. I am turning it into a foster care facility. She knew that. Nana was confused, my father said sharply. His eyes were like ice. She didn't know what she was signing, and we both know, Alice, that you have a history of being, overwhelmed. We're trying to save you from yourself. That was the dagger. They were using my own struggles, the anxiety I had battled in my 20s against me. They were rewriting history to make me look weak and manipulative. I looked at the settlement paper. $50,000. It was a lot of money. It was an escape hatch. All I had to do was sign it, and the fear would go away. I could leave. I could stop fighting. Then I looked up at the ceiling, where a water stain I had fixed last week used to be. I remembered Nana sitting in this hallway, lucid for just a moment, grabbing my hand and saying, "Make it full of life again, Ali." I picked up the settlement offer. The paper felt crisp and expensive. I said softly, "You're right." My mother smiled, a tight, victorious expression. "I knew you'd be reasonable." "I am overwhelmed," I continued. "Overwhelmed by your audacity." I ripped the paper in half. The sound was loud in the empty hall. I ripped it again and again, letting the pieces flutter down on their polished shoes. "Get out," I said. My father's face turned a shade of red I rarely saw. "You are making a mistake, Alice. We will destroy you in court. We will drag your name through the mud until no one will hire you to walk a dog, let alone run a foster home. Get out." They turned and left. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them, shaking the frame. I locked it, slid down to the floor among the scraps of their offer. And for the first time since Nana died, I cried. But I wasn't crying because I was sad. I was crying because war had just been declared.
The retaliation didn't take long. It arrived 48 hours after I ripped up their check, not in the form of another legal notice, but as a notification on my laptop screen. I was sitting at the makeshift kitchen table, a sheet of plywood over two sawhorses, trying to finish a logo design for a local bakery. My phone pinged, then it pinged again. Then it started vibrating continuously, dancing across the plywood. I opened the local news site. The headline was bold, black, and designed to destroy. The dark side of charity, local designer accused of coercing dementia patient. My breath hitched. I clicked the link, my hand trembling on the mouse. The article was a masterpiece of fiction. It quoted family sources who claimed I had isolated my grandmother, cut her off from her loving son and daughter, and forced her to sign a new will while she was in a state of delirium. It painted me not as a granddaughter, but as a predator. Loving son and daughter, I whispered, a bitter laugh escaping my throat. They didn't even know her cardiologist's name. The phone rang in my hand. It was the owner of the bakery I was designing for. Alice? Her voice was tight. I saw the article, Sarah. It's a lie. My parents are trying to... I can't use the logo. I'm sorry. We're a community business. I can't have this kind of baggage attached to our brand. I'm going to have to go with someone else. Sarah, please. I need this job to pay for the lawyer. I'm sorry, Alice. The line went dead. By noon, I had lost 3 clients. By 2 p.m., a news van was idling at the bottom of my driveway. I pulled the curtains shut, plunging the house into gloom. I knew I couldn't hide. I needed representation. But the high-powered lawyers my parents had hired charged $500 an hour. I had $1,200 in my checking account. I drove into the city, parking my rusted truck in a cramped lot behind a strip mall that smelled of exhaust and frying onions. The sign above the door read, Gorski and Associates, Legal Aid. Mr. Gorski looked like a man who had been sleeping in his suit for 3 days. His office was a claustrophobic box, stacked high with files that seemed ready to topple over and crush us both. He didn't offer me coffee. He just leafed through the copy of the lawsuit I had brought, sighing every few seconds. It's ugly, he grunted, not looking up. They've got affidavits. Affidavits from who? I asked, leaning forward. No one saw Nana except me. 2 nurses from the visiting agency, Gorski said, tapping a page. They claim they heard you yelling at her. Claim they saw you withholding food until she signed checks. My blood ran cold. That's a lie. I fired those nurses because they were stealing Nana's pain medication. I reported them. Gorski finally looked up. His eyes were tired, red-rimmed. Did you keep the police report? I didn't file a police report. I just fired them. I didn't want the stress for Nana. Gorski dropped the file onto the desk with a heavy thud. Then it's your word against theirs. And right now, their word is backed by your parents' money and a very expensive legal team. These people, your parents, they play to win, Ms. Vance. They're burying you in paper before we even get to court. Can we win? I asked. My voice felt small in the cramped room. Gorski rubbed his face. If we find proof, hard proof, not just memories. Otherwise, you're looking at losing the house, the money, and possibly facing criminal charges for elder abuse if the DA picks up what the civil court puts down. I walked out of his office into the drizzle. The city felt gray and hostile. I had no clients, a lawyer who looked defeated before we started, and a reputation that was currently being shredded online. I drove back to the house, my only sanctuary, and saw the for sale sign my father had planted in the lawn while I was gone. It wasn't official, but it was a message. You don't own this anymore. I got out of the truck, walked over to the sign, and kicked it until the wood snapped. It was a small victory, But as I stood there in the rain, looking up at the dark, silent house, I realized Gorski was right. I needed proof. But Nana was gone, and the dead don't testify.
The weeks bled into a blur of legal motions and mounting bills. The court date was set. My bank account was in the red. I was eating instant noodles and selling my grandmother's old silverware just to keep the electricity on. But worst of all was the noise, the constant mental noise of my parents' lies echoing in my head. I needed silence. I needed to work. One rainy Tuesday, trying to distract myself from an impending deposition, I climbed up to the attic. It was the only room I hadn't touched yet. It was a cavernous space, filled with the detritus of a life lived long and full. Trunks of moth-eaten clothes, stacks of National Geographic from the 1980s, and furniture covered in white sheets like ghosts. I started moving boxes, looking for anything I could sell or donate. The air was thick with dust motes dancing in the singular beam of light, cutting through the circular window. I dragged a heavy cedar chest away from the wall. As I did, the floorboard beneath it groaned and popped up slightly. It wasn't nailed down. I frowned. Nana was meticulous. She never left a repair unfinished. I knelt, wedging my fingers into the gap, and pried the board loose. Beneath the floor, nestled in the pink insulation like a buried secret, was a metal lockbox. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pulled it out. It was cold, heavy, and locked. I didn't have a key, but I knew where Nana kept her spares, in a hollowed-out book on her nightstand downstairs. I sprinted down, retrieved the small brass key, and ran back up, breathless. The key turned with a satisfying click. I opened the lid. Inside wasn't jewelry or cash. It was paper. Specifically, a leather-bound journal and a thick file folder labeled R and D in Nana's shaky cursive. Richard and Diane. I opened the journal first. The entries were dated 5 years ago, right when my parents started claiming Nana was losing it. June 12th. They came again today. Richard yelled. He said I was a burden. He said if I didn't sign the power of attorney, they would put me in a state home. I told them to leave. Diane laughed at me. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty attic. I flipped the pages. July 4th. I am scared. I think they are talking to my doctor. I heard Richard on the phone saying I was confused. I am not confused. I know exactly what they are doing. They want the money for Richard's gambling debt. Gambling debt? My father? The esteemed investor? I reached for the file folder. Inside were bank statements, copies Nana must have intercepted from my father's mail years ago when he stayed here briefly. They showed massive transfers to casinos in Macau and Las Vegas. Millions lost. But at the bottom of the folder was the smoking gun. It was a transcript, a literal transcript. Attached to it was a note. I recorded our conversation today. I knew they would lie. I am hiding this because I don't trust them not to burn it. I pulled out a small digital voice recorder that had been taped to the back of the folder. I pressed play. The audio was crackly, but the voices were unmistakable. "Just sign the damn paper, Mother," Richard's voice sneered. "You're old. You don't need this house.
Sell it, give us the cash, and we'll make sure you're comfortable. Don't, and we'll have you declared incompetent. We've already paid the doctor to say so." Then my mother's voice, sharp and cold. "Do it, or we leave you here to rot, old woman. No one will believe you over us." I sat back on my heels, the recorder trembling in my hand. Tears streamed down my face, hot and fast. They hadn't just neglected her. They had terrorized her. They had tried to gaslight her into believing she was insane so they could cover their own financial ruin. And they were doing the exact same thing to me. I gripped the recorder. The fear that had been paralyzing me for weeks evaporated, replaced with a cold, hard rage. You wanted a fight? You got one. The King County Courthouse was a cathedral of echoes and polished marble, designed to make you feel small. It was working. I sat at the defendant's table, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles were white. Beside me, Mr. Gorski was organizing his files, but his hands were shaking. He smelled of stale coffee and fear. Across the aisle, my parents looked like royalty in exile. My father, Richard, wore a dark navy suit that screamed respectability. My mother, Diane, was dressed in a soft, modest cardigan, something I had never seen her wear in my life. She dabbed at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. Judge Holloway swept in. He was a severe man with a face carved from granite and eyes that seemed to have seen every lie ever told. He sat down, adjusted his glasses, and looked at me. His gaze wasn't neutral. It was impatient. He had read the motions. He had read the smear articles. To him, I was just another greedy millennial trying to cheat the elderly. "Mr. Sterling, you may call your first witness," the judge said. My parents' lawyer, a man with a shark smile and a voice like oiled velvet, stood up. "The plaintiffs call Richard Vance to the stand." My father walked to the witness box. He placed his hand on the Bible. He swore to tell the truth. Then he began the performance of a lifetime. "We just wanted what was best for Mother. She was slipping away. We tried to intervene, to get her professional help, but Alice blocked us at every turn." "Blocked you how?" Sterling asked gently. "She changed the locks," he lied, looking mournfully at the jury. "She screened our calls. She told Mother we didn't love her. It broke my heart to see my own mother afraid of us because of the lies my daughter told her." I felt a scream building in my throat. I looked at the bag at my feet, a battered canvas messenger bag. Inside, wrapped in a plastic grocery sack, was the lockbox contents, the recorder, the journal. Let him talk, I told myself. Let him lie on the record. "And the finances?" Sterling pressed. "We discovered the accounts were drained," Richard said, shaking his head. "Alice claimed it was for repairs, but looking at the house, it's a ruin. I fear the money was used for personal debts, or perhaps to fund a lifestyle she couldn't afford." Gorski stood up, halfway. "Objection." "Sustained," Judge Holloway said, waving a hand dismissively. "But move it along, counselor." My mother took the stand next. She was even better. She described a fictional version of me, a volatile, angry woman who hated the family. She claimed Nana had called her, crying, begging to be saved from me. "I just want justice for my mother," Diane sobbed into the microphone. I don't care about the money. I just want to know that she didn't die thinking we abandoned her." The courtroom was silent. The jury looked at me with open disgust. Even the stenographer looked pitying. "Your witness," Sterling said, smirking at Gorski. Gorski stood up. He fumbled with his notes. He asked a few weak questions about dates and times, which my mother deflected with ease. She looked fragile, victimized. Gorski looked like a bully for even asking. "No further questions," he mumbled, sitting down heavily. "We're losing," he whispered to me, wiping sweat from his forehead. "The judge hates us. If you have a settlement figure in mind, Alice, now is the time to offer it." I looked at my parents. They were leaning close to each other, whispering. My father winked at my mother. It was quick, subtle, but I saw it. A wink of victory. They thought it was over. They thought they had crushed me. I reached down and unzipped my bag. The metal of the recorder was cold against my fingertips. "No settlement," I whispered back to Gorski. "Alice, be reasonable." "I don't want to be reasonable," I said, my voice hardening as I looked at the judge.
The walk from the defendant's table to the witness stand felt like walking the plank. The wood floor seemed to stretch for miles. Every step echoed. I sat in the chair. It was hard, uncomfortable, and elevated just enough to make me feel isolated from the rest of the human race. Mr. Gorski stood up. He looked pale. "Ms. Vance, did you coerce your grandmother into changing her will?" "No," I said firmly. "Did you love her?" "She was my best friend." Gorski nodded, looking defeated. "No further questions." He sat down. He was throwing the towel in. He wanted this to be over so he could go back to his office and forget he ever met me. Sterling rose like a cobra uncoiling. He buttoned his expensive jacket and approached the stand. He didn't look at me. He looked at the jury, smiling. "Ms. Vance," he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "let's talk about money. You're a freelance designer, correct?" "Yes." "And business hasn't been booming lately." "It has been difficult," I admitted. "Difficult," he repeated, savoring the word. "So difficult that you were, in fact, 3 months behind on your own rent before you moved into your grandmother's mansion. Is that correct?" "I moved in to care for her. Yes or no, Ms. Vance?" "Yes." "So," Sterling turned to me, his eyes hard, "you were broke, desperate, and here was a confused, wealthy old woman. It's quite a temptation, isn't it, to whisper things in her ear, to make her afraid of the only people who could actually help her, her own son and daughter." "I didn't make her afraid. She was already afraid." Sterling laughed. It was a short sound, sharp. Afraid of what? Of her son paying her medical bills? Of her daughter bringing her flowers? We have heard testimony all morning about their devotion. Do you have a single shred of proof, anything other than your own self-serving words, that implies my clients were anything but loving?" The courtroom was silent. The jury leaned forward. This was the kill shot. He expected me to stammer, to cry, to look at my hands. I looked at my parents. Richard was inspecting his fingernails. Diane was looking at the ceiling, bored. They were so sure. I looked back at Sterling. "You asked if I have proof." "I did, but we both know you don't, because it doesn't exist." "Actually," I said, reaching into the pocket of my blazer, "it does." Sterling's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Excuse me?" I pulled out the folded transcript, the one Nana had typed up herself after listening to the recording, having learned from Gorski that digital copies were safer than the original device in court. "I found a lockbox under the attic floorboards. My grandmother hid it. She called it her insurance policy."
"Objection!" Sterling shouted, his composure shattering instantly. "This evidence was not disclosed in discovery." "I found it yesterday," I lied smoothly. "I haven't had time to disclose it, but it is directly relevant to your question, counselor. You asked for proof." Judge Holloway looked up from his notes. For the first time, he looked interested. "What is that in your hand, Ms. Vance?" "It's a transcript of a conversation between my grandmother and the plaintiffs, dated June 12th, 5 years ago, the day they claimed they were saving her. It also contains bank records regarding my father's gambling debts in Macau." In the gallery, my father stood up so fast, his chair screeched against the floor. "That's a lie," he roared. "She forged it." "Sit down, Mr. Vance," the bailiff barked. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. He looked at my father, red-faced and panting, and then back at me. The boredom was gone. "Bring that here," the judge ordered, pointing a finger at me. "Your Honor, I object strenuously." Sterling was sweating now. "This is highly irregular. We haven't authenticated." "You opened the door, Mr. Sterling," Holloway snapped. "You asked if she had proof. She says she does. I want to see it." I stepped down from the stand. My legs were shaking, but I forced myself to walk tall. I crossed the floor, past the stunned jury, past the terrified Sterling, and handed the paper to the bailiff, who handed it up to the judge. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the rustle of paper as Judge Holloway put on his reading glasses and looked down at the document that would decide my life.
Time didn't just slow down, it curdled. The air in the courtroom grew heavy, pressing against my eardrums. The only sound in the universe was the dry, rasping noise of Judge Holloway turning a page. I stood near the witness box, my hands trembling by my sides. I watched Holloway's face. For the first minute, his expression was granite, immovable, bored. Then he reached the second page. His eyebrows twitched. He reached the third page, the part where my father threatened to leave Nana to rot. The blood drained from Holloway's face so fast it looked like a magic trick. He went pale, a sickly gray color under the harsh fluorescent lights. He stopped reading. He didn't look up immediately. He just stared at the paper, his jaw tightening until a muscle leapt in his cheek. "Judge," Sterling ventured, his voice cracking, "my client." Holloway held up a hand. It wasn't a request for silence, it was a command. He looked up and the boredom was gone. In its place was a cold, terrifying fury. He looked directly at my parents. Richard was still standing, red-faced and panting. Diane was clutching her pearls, looking confused. "Bailiff," Holloway said. His voice was low, barely a whisper, but it carried to the back of the room. "Lock the doors." The command hit the room like a physical blow. "Excuse me, Your Honor?" the bailiff asked, hesitating. "I said lock the doors," Holloway roared, slamming his hand down on the bench. "And call for backup, now!" The bailiff scrambled to the double doors, engaging the heavy deadbolts with a loud thud-thud. The sound echoed like gunshots. Panic rippled through the gallery. My mother let out a small, high-pitched whimper. Sterling looked like he was about to vomit. He began backing away from the plaintiff's table as if it were radioactive. "Your Honor, I must protest," Sterling squeaked. "This is unlawful imprisonment." "Sit down, counselor, before I hold you in contempt," Holloway snapped. He held up the transcript, shaking it at my parents. "You came into my courtroom, you swore on a Bible, and you presented a narrative that this document proves beyond a shadow of a doubt is a fabrication." He looked at my father. "Mr. Vance, this transcript details a conspiracy to defraud an elder adult. It details coercion. It details threats of physical neglect." "It's a fake!" Richard screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She wrote it! She's the liar!"
The metadata on the flash drive will prove the dates, and the voice recognition will prove it's you." "That is enough," Holloway cut in. He pressed a button on his console. Suddenly, the side doors burst open. 4 uniformed sheriff's deputies stormed in, their hands resting on their belts, scanning the room for a threat. "Secure the plaintiffs," Holloway ordered, pointing at my parents. "Take them into custody immediately." "What?" my mother shrieked. It wasn't a cry of sadness. It was the sound of entitlement being shattered. "You can't do this. Do you know who we are?" "I know exactly who you are, Mrs. Vance. You are perjurers, and based on this evidence, likely felons." The deputies moved in. They didn't treat them like socialites. They treated them like criminals. One deputy grabbed my father's arm and twisted it behind his back. Richard struggled, his face turning purple. "Get your hands off me! I'll sue you! I'll sue this whole city!" Richard bellowed, thrashing against the officer. "Stop resisting!" the deputy shouted, forcing Richard's chest down onto the polished mahogany table. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting shut, click, 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 cut through the chaos. My mother didn't fight. She just collapsed into her chair, sobbing hysterically, watching her husband being manhandled. A female deputy pulled her up, cuffing her wrists gently but firmly. "This case is dismissed with prejudice," Holloway announced, glaring at the scene. "I am referring this matter to the district attorney for immediate criminal prosecution on charges of perjury, attempted fraud, and elder abuse." I stood frozen, watching the people who had terrified me for my entire life being dragged toward the holding cell door. As they passed me, my father looked up. His eyes met mine. There was no anger left, just shock. He looked old. He looked small. He looked defeated. I walked out of the courthouse and stopped on the top step. For weeks, the city had been nothing but gray skies and relentless, hammering rain. But as I pushed through the heavy revolving doors, I squinted. The clouds were breaking apart, torn open like wet cotton, revealing patches of brilliant, hard blue. The sun was trying to push through, making the wet pavement steam and glitter. Mr. Gorski stumbled out behind me, blinking in the sudden brightness. He looked like a man who had just survived a plane crash. He loosened his tie, staring at me with a mixture of confusion and awe. "I have practiced law for 30 years, he said, shaking his head. "I have never seen a judge lock the doors. Never." "They underestimated her," I said softly. I wasn't talking about myself. I was talking about Nana. They thought she was weak because she was old. They didn't know she was documenting every single second. Gorski chuckled, a dry, rusty sound. "Well, Miss Vance, you're the owner of the estate, free and clear. And your parents? They won't be bothering anyone for a very long time. The DA doesn't take kindly to people who try to play the court for a fool." He held out a hand. I shook it. His grip was firm this time. "Good luck, Alice." I walked to my truck. The ticket on the windshield for an expired meter didn't even annoy me. I tossed it in the glove box and started the engine. The drive home was silent. No phone calls, no threats, no anxiety gnawing at my stomach, just the hum of the tires on the drying road. When I pulled into the driveway, the Victorian house loomed above me. Before, it had looked like a burden, a rotting pile of wood that was ruining my life. Now, with the sun hitting the slate roof, it looked like a fortress. It looked like a promise. I walked over to the broken "for sale" sign, lying in the mud where I had kicked it weeks ago. I picked it up and tossed it into the back of the truck. Inside, the house was quiet. The dust motes danced in the light of the foyer. I walked up the stairs, past the spot where my parents had offered me $50,000 to disappear, and into the front room I had been painting before the nightmare started. The roller was still in the tray, the paint dried and cracking. I went to the window and looked out at the overgrown garden. I could see it now. Not the weeds, but what it would become. A swing set under the oak tree, a vegetable garden near the fence, a place where kids who had been thrown away by the world could come and realize they mattered. My phone buzzed. I pulled it out, half expecting a ghost. It was Sarah, the bakery owner who had fired me. Saw the news. The police report is trending. I am so sorry, Alice. If you're still willing, we'd love to have you back. I deleted the message. I didn't need her. I had work that mattered more than logos. I walked over to the corner where Nana's old radio sat. I turned the dial until the soft crackle of a jazz station filled the room, her favorite. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full of her. I picked up a fresh paintbrush, dipped it into a new can of primer, and covered a dark stain on the wall with a stroke of bright, clean white. Okay, Nana, let's get back to work. The cycle stopped here. My parents chose greed. I chose this. I was home.